Okay, that's great. So obviously we've got Larry and David as the main show today. I don't think Larry needs any introduction whatsoever. He's no stranger to DPUK. He has presented at our Canterbury conference historically, and also participated in Zoom meetings since COVID became a feature in our life. David, you may know less about, but if you listen to Rob Clark and Doug Campbell's shows, he is quite regularly referred to as the Eastern Seaboard correspondent. Having listened to the two Chuck Celli podcasts that Larry and David did, it seems quite obvious that a lot of the groundwork on the research that the pair of them did on Red Bird was done by David. So, thank you and a welcome to David as well. So, without further ado, guys, you can have the floor, do whatever you want, grab screens, tag team, and we're ready to go. I mean, obviously this subject is very, very broad. In fact, I mean, although it's a couple of leads relating to what happened at Red Bird, the rabbit holes and dimensions that they're going to go into is there should be enough for anyone that's got particular interest in a lot of the aspects of this whole JFK saga. So off you go, guys, please.
Right. Let me bring up the PowerPoint, I guess. Let me get the share screen.
While David's doing that, I'm happy to be back with DPUK. I always enjoy this. So thanks for having us.
This was the presentation we did for Lancer in November. This, stop me anytime but this is, when we started to look at Matthew Smith's work, we found it was really interesting, especially his descriptions of the Cuban pilot and the American Air Force colonel. So this is the actual text I pulled from his book, that he said that the Cuban pilot said. I'll give everybody a chance to look it over if you want.
And just to give a little backstory, Neil and I talked about this a little bit at the very beginning. Everyone should realize this is all due to Matthew Smith's original research. Going to Dallas, contacting Wayne January. At first, it's interesting. The reason that Matthew showed up in Dallas talking to January has nothing to do with this specific lead we're talking about. It has to do with lead number 2 that we'll get to later on in the presentation. January was on record of going to the FBI and talking about a visit by some people trying to rent a plane. And that was in the records that's covered in, an FBI report. And that was Matthew's stimulus to go to interview Wayne January. And so they talked about that. It was only after a considerable period of time, a number of years, that January became comfortable enough to Wayne to talk to him about this lead that we're getting into here. So it wasn't the starting point. And it's important to remember that Matthew and Wayne got to know each other over a period of years to build this confidence level to even produce what we're talking about in these leads. It certainly wasn't their first meeting. It certainly was more than what January had told the FBI, because part of the backstory is that January thought this incident was important enough and significant enough to take to the FBI. In the FBI interview, which Matthew obtained, you can see they are very much not interested in what January has to say about these visitors, even though he does identify one as resembling Lee Oswald. In fact, Matthew himself told me, and we worked on this over many years, that January was scared off almost immediately because what the FBI agents wanted to talk to him about is whether or not he had been to the Carousel Club, whether he knew Jack Ruby, whether he was a friend of Jack Ruby. And it's quite interesting if you review the FBI reports from this period of time, which within 90 days of the assassination, whenever they go to interview someone in Dallas who supposedly had seen Lee Oswald going in for a job appointment, an interview, at the car, they immediately start talking about Jack Ruby. And that pushes people away because it's like they're trying to suck these people in as being suspects. And that's the way January told Matthew that he felt, and he just basically stopped talking to them after it appeared to him they were interested in connecting him to Ruby more than anything else. And it became even more interesting when Matthew showed Wayne a copy of the FBI interview and showed him that the FBI had totally misrepresented what January had said about when this visit happened. They had backdated it 6 months to spring, and it had actually occurred like 3 days before the assassination. And when he saw that, January was again, impressed by the fact that clearly they didn't want to have to react to a lead that he had given them. So I think that's an important part of the backstory to this in terms of the way Matthew got into it, the bond that he built with January, and the work that he originally did that we're carrying on. And that, quite frankly, even before David and I started working on it, I had been carrying on it with Matthew Smith and have been involved in it now for probably 20 years myself, beyond the original work Matthew did. So I'll take it back to you, David, so we can talk about this lead is essentially emerged over, once the two got comfortable with Wayne January relating to Matthew Smith, what had been going on that week in Dallas in his preparation of an aircraft that was being purchased by unspecified parties. And it was one in a series of aircraft that January had processed for these people who he always suspected were indeed the CIA. And so as we set the stage for this lead, it's January talking to people who had showed up to take possession of an aircraft legally and technically with FAA certification. And this is the dialogue that resulted during this period of time, which was the week prior to the assassination. I should also mention that aircraft had been at Red Bird Airfield being worked on for some 2-3 months before the assassination. The paperwork on the aircraft show it arriving in Dallas in August of 1963.
So we decided to take a look at the colonel first. Possibility, who could the colonel be? And this is some of the information that Matthew Smith got from the Cuban and from Wayne himself, Wayne January. So we know the buyer bought the plane via phone. He would appear in person to handle the paperwork later on. The aircraft was, like Larry said, was one of the last in a series of sales. He brought his pilot along to verify and make sure the DC-3 was ready. And January met the colonel briefly on the first day, and how he described him was smart, well-dressed, with the appearance of a military man. Then the Cuban pilot himself stated that the colonel was a flyer. This is good clues for us here. An Air Force colonel that deals with planes of this category. That means he flew DC-3s, C-47s. And this is key too. The job had to be finished no later than Friday morning, 11:22. He says, my boss wants to return to Florida. Another clue. He's the Air Force colonel from Florida. Dealt with these planes. So immediately, some of the work we did earlier in the Wheaton leads, Jenkins and those guys, we came up with the possibility that The colonel was U.S. Air Force Colonel Manny Chavez. Interesting guy. A lot of background information. It took us a while to draw a picture to see who this guy was and where he came from and who he associated with. And it always goes back to the same, like I always tell Larry, the same band of brothers, the same crew. He's one of the original crew. He was in PB Success in Guatemala. He was good friends with Dave Morales. They shared a desk together for 4 months in Miami. Good friends with Jake Easterline. He was military Air Force attaché in Caracas in 57 to 59. And then he became part of the Cuba project prior to the Bay of Pigs. Let's see what else we know about him. Who was he? This is key. His pseudonym was Russell Sambora. It took us a long time to get that one out there. He also had a couple different other aliases in the paperwork and some of the documents, referred to as the Mexican, because he was from New Mexico. And I guess they teased him a lot because he was good friends with all these people. So quite a sense of humor. See, he was assigned to the JM Wave from JM Wave to support the Emerald effort, October 29th, 1963, which is a very interesting date too. He had been this is what I went over earlier, Miami station with Dave Morales on the Cuba project since 1960. And Morales had served in Venezuela together. So these guys knew each other pretty well. And this is from his own words here. During the Korean conflict, he was called back to active duty and received training in the U.S. Army Counterintelligence School. So this guy was an intelligence guy, it's being just an air attaché. He was assigned to the Miami office, 60 to 64. And he actually mentions Morales by name here. They worked in office, shared desks during the 4-month period in 61. Until eventually Morales went to JM Wave in Miami, and Chavez ended up working for the domestic contact division in Florida. He was there interviewing a lot of the Cubans as they came over. Him, I think Sam Cale, Luis Rodriguez, they all were interviewing recent, people, exiles, people that recently exiled. A little bit more on Chavez. Larry, you want to talk about his role in my allergies?
Yeah,
kicking up a little
I think this is very important because, again, why do we suspect that Chavez was the person involved in this aircraft acquisition? And there would have been no suspicion of this. We wouldn't have been able to follow this lead until we were able to fully understand what was going on in 1963 within the Cuba Project, Special Affairs staff at JM Wave, and the new project. And the new project that actually Chavez got assigned to in 1963 was the Emerald Project. The reason Chavez got assigned to it is, well, twofold. Basically, there weren't that many personnel around JM Wave that had experience with aircraft. I mean, the Wave station had primarily been a boat station with maritime operations. And so when Emerald was started, it was the whole goal of the project was to create a deniable Cuban exile force operating totally outside the United States. It's going to need boats, it's going to need aircraft, it's going to have to move overseas. And Chavez became the ideal person and one of the few people available to support the project in acquisitions. So one of his roles, and David found documents on all this, was to help obtain the boats, the aircraft, the weapons, the ammunition. And that puts him in a perfect position to have been acquiring aircraft such as the DC-3 that we know were acquired for the project. So he's a perfect fit for the kind of personnel that would be associated with acquiring aircraft covertly for a project that had just started in the summer timeframe and was just getting underway in August and September with its first acquisitions. So understanding what was going on in 1963 with the CIA in equipment acquisitions, understanding AmWorld, and finding the documents on Chava's role was key to taking us forward to a candidate for a person who might have been taking possession for an aircraft that was being purchased for CIA.
If you notice too, who does he go to see in Mexico City? David Phillips. Again, the same small group of people dealing with each other. You have Tony Sforza meeting with David Phillips on 11/22. So it's the same people, it's the same crew. Once you get through a lot of the pseudonyms and aliases and who's contacting who during this period, it's the same people over and over again. They had worked together previously and they knew each other well, they trusted each other. So this is who we see that keeps coming up in these research. I think we go over some names at the end.
David Phillips was actually the only person
Chavez
in Mexico City cleared for AmWorld.
Mexican military. Chavez worked closely with the Mexican military, and these are the people he actually worked with over the years when he was in Latin America as a air attaché. He actually goes through and mentions a lot of the countries he worked with. And Mexico was big, one of his, he had a lot of, if you look at the Russell Sambora documents, you'll see, people he was contacting with, who he's contact with. And yeah, AmWorld had no air staff at the time, no pilots on board. They were trying to hire people. We've got a couple names of who they got in November of '63. And again, he's probably our number one candidate, who was the colonel that appeared at Red Bird Airfield. And again, it was just met very briefly. He was in a hurry. Why would they had to be out by, Friday before noon. They had to get it done. Let's take a look at, do you guys have any questions at this point before we continue on with the Cuban? I know it's a new name, and sometimes these new names are tough to see where they fit.
David, let me insert just something a little before questions so that everybody understands. This is a little bit more backstory. What Matthew Smith could never get from January, before January's death, was the actual identification of this aircraft. In other words, the FAA certification numbers, the tail numbers. And clearly, January was very concerned because he had been working with the CIA. It was only after his death that his wife contacted Matthew and said that she had been authorized to provide him that information after January's death, which she did at the time. Matthew was unable to do anything with it. I was fortunately able to contact someone at the FAA who ultimately gave me the entire research file on the aircraft, so we can know who owned it, basically verify everything that January said about the aircraft, including the aircraft being one of a series that he had handled. Without that paperwork from the FAA and ownership of the aircraft, which traces it all the way through 1965, but shows that it was still on the federal books, even though it was ostensibly owned by a Mexican airline, it was on the federal registry as a possession until 1984. Without that paperwork, it would have been impossible to substantiate January's story to the extent that we can now.
Larry, hi, it's Neil. I was going to save these questions to the end, but as we've had a bit of a pause, can you just answer some very basic stuff? Who owned Red Bird Airfield, and have you looked into Wayne January's business, and how he developed the relationship with potentially, CIA entities.
Red Bird Airfield was just a general commercial airfield, nothing special about it. January was one of a number of businesses that occupied facilities on the airfield. His primary business was leasing aircraft, by the week, by the day, for flight training. He handled repairs on aircraft. And basically, his business was to acquire, lease, transfer aircraft, and he was one of several. Nothing special about him. There were businesses like that across the U.S. and other businesses in Texas. This particular business, this aircraft had been purchased from a company in Galveston. He had purchased it and he resold it to the Houston Air Center in Houston. It's just a regular transaction. Anybody could walk in, that was January told specifically that this was for a CIA project? Absolutely not. He just knew that the government, the US government, and there were agencies buying aircraft, and actually he did repairs on the aircraft when it was in Dallas. He did some reconfiguration. He took out a radar system. He put in a new radar system. He did some mechanical work on the aircraft. All of that had to be recertified while it was there before it could be transferred to Houston Air Center for purchase. So basically, January, like hundreds of other businesses, simply served as a commercial outlet that the agency used when it needed to do something, not under its own name, and make the purchase a federal purchase.
Right. Just before we go on, I think Scott has got a question.
So I'm just trying to take myself off mute there, sorry. It's just a point of clarification. My knowledge of aircraft isn't that great. I'm sure in the book that Matthew Smith wrote, JFK, I think it's called The Second Plot, he refers to a Cessna or Piper Cub aircraft. Is that the same type of aircraft that we're talking about here in terms of the plane that had to take off in the morning of the 22nd?
That is the same aircraft, but I will say Matthew wrote that book well before any of the research that we're doing now. So even Matthew and I talked a lot while he was doing that. Honestly, a lot of what you see in the book is speculative based on what he knew about the aircraft at the time. We just know more about it now. But Scott, yes, absolutely, it's the same aircraft.
Okay, thank you.
And I started with the second plot myself. That's where I got my introduction to Matthew.
So we started looking at the Cuban too. We went through a bunch of different possibilities, suspects at the time. And we looked at one was Tony Soto. He was Bay of Pigs pilot. Was Air Force. He kind of fit the bill. But ended up discarding him a little, even though he was briefly part of AmWorld and later went to the Congo, earlier in the Congo and later in the Congo, working for Rip Robertson as a pilot over there. Eventually, the more research we did, we settled on another guy based upon these clues here. He spoke English with little accent, was familiar with the transport aircraft. He flew it, his similar planes inside Cuba. He was an officer in the Cuban Air Force. And January's description described him as a younger man, late 30s, well-built, muscular, had short, neat brown hair, physically trim, being of medium weight and height. So Soto was a little bit shorter, like 5'4" or something. He was also a member of the 2506 Brigade, so that gave us a little few more clues. We got the list of all the 40 pilots, you know, and co-pilots, navigators that were involved in the brigade and the Bay of Pigs. And held a position which he worked with and offered advice to the Americans directing its air operations. That was a big clue. You know, speaks English, and he's talking directly to the American air people, you know. And he himself had flown in support of the landings of the Bay of Pigs. Again, that kind of rounded out who this guy might be a little bit further. So we go, who could possibly do that? So this is a little bit more on it. As you know, the Cuban and Wayne January started working together, became comfortable with Wayne after working, you know, several days trying to get the plane together. He was speaking further about his experience. I don't know if I'll read a little bit of this out loud. He was particularly outspoken in relating that his friends had died during the Bay of Pigs landings because JFK had not delivered the promised air cover for them. During the conversations, talk of the president coming to Dallas apparently agitated the Cuban. He related that to January, that JFK would be killed in revenge for his comrade's death. And he's saying he's going to be killed. He said that they, whoever they were, that's kind of flesh out who they would be, were going to kill RFK also because he had convinced his brother not to send planes. I'm sure Larry could go into a little bit of depth on RFK had nothing to do with actually convincing his brother not to send the planes to support the landings at the Bay of Pigs. And, you know, because the Kennedys were now in the way of efforts to overthrow Castro. That was, you know, the ground level thoughts that a lot of the anti-Castro Cubans had and some of the JM Wave officers had based upon their limited knowledge of what actually went on there. And said January did note that Smith, that there was an absolute need to have the aircraft ready to depart on Friday. And when their work had not been completed Thursday, they worked into the evening to make sure it could be ready for Friday morning, getting ready to get out of there Friday. Larry, do you want to go into a little bit of the Bay of Pigs, who was actually talking, or do we want to cover that later too? Canceling the airstrikes.
I think this is important because, again, all of this is a cumulative process. It's amazing, you know, what the other things you have to study to get to where we are now. For example, until I did the work that I did 3 or 4 years ago on the Cuba project and the Bay of Pigs, and until David did some work in documents, we wouldn't have come up with our current Cuban suspect because we didn't really understand the roles of the Cubans in the Bay of Pigs, specifically in the air area. You know a lot more about them in terms of the infantry, but not in the air aspect of the missions. And it was only until we found out that this particular individual, who's our primary suspect, was essentially in command of the Cuban air unit and was the Cuban who interfaced with the Americans who were running the project from a military standpoint. And not only did he interface, the documents that we found showed that he personally, on the day of the initial strikes in Cuba, went to his CIA supervisor, military supervisor, and asked to talk directly to President Kennedy to tell him how badly the airstrikes were needed. He was made promises that would happen. It didn't happen. As we now know, and as I relate in the book In Denial, we know exactly why that didn't happen and who blocked it and who stopped it and why Kennedy didn't get involved in the conversation. But we know that this particular individual was irate at not being allowed to go up the chain of command with his protest. And actually what he did instead was he volunteered and flew as a navigator on the second day strikes over the beachhead. So this really, because we know now this level of detail within the Cuban participants themselves, it really helped us filter out the one guy who fits every box that David has just related in January's description. It's that background work that gave us the key.
let's take a look at who our candidate would be. Manuel Villafana. Well, I'll just say probably Villafana. It's probably easier for me to pronounce. Two crypts he had, CIA crypts, was L.I. Taint one. That's when he was working in Mexico City, and he was first recruited by the CIA. Eventually, they ended up adding the AM, which indicates Cuba, to it. So AM L.I. Taint one. We'll look at that a little bit later when he became chief of Commandos Mambises. You know, very interesting guy. Let's take a look at who he was, what he was doing. Here he is defecting. August 59, 2 Cuban liaison officers attached to the Cuban embassy in Mexico City began the process of defecting from the Castro regime. This is when they started to suspect that Castro was indeed a communist. Again, no, Villafana was the Cuban air attaché to the Mexican Air Force. He expressed his dissatisfaction with the communist influence over the Castro government. And the CIA officer he dealt with was Hazlitt. He talked with Villafana and a Cuban Navy attaché. Both men agreed to remain in their current position, so they defected in place, so, while cooperating with the CIA on intelligence collections on the new Castro regime. And this is where he got his CIA crypt, L.I. Taint one. He also was recruited to, because of his experience being a attaché, part of the Cuban exile group, the FRD, military organization circa November 1940s, when he first came on board. He was given the rank of colonel, designated as the head of the FRD military force. This guy was pretty far up there. Politically, he was a supporter of Manuel Adame, and remained so well into the era of the Adame AmWorld project, which began in '63. That's, again, one of the primary reasons he was probably recruited. He was a big backer of Adame's and pulled into the AmWorld. So became the military air officer in charge of the CIA's Cuban air unit. So he was the #1 guy in charge of the air unit. Assumed the leadership role with the Cuban personnel. However, the actual training and operational activities were largely planned and overseen by American CIA personnel. Villafana's role proved to be largely advisory. He talked to these guys and tell them about the strengths and weaknesses of the pilots and what they can do. And he also represented the FRD. And during the Pay of Pigs landings, Villafana represented the Cuban air unit in pleading, this is key, Larry will go into this a little bit more detail, that the president changed his decision on canceling the airstrikes. He was the guy that has actually talked to the CIA personnel, and he told them, get on the phone, call Kennedy, let's not cancel this. This is critical. Larry, do you have any background on the actual, what Villafana and who he was talking to at this time?
Yeah, we know that he would have been talking to the military liaisons with a group that came out of headquarters, which included a fellow named Jenkins and a fellow named Moore, who were playing key roles in the chain of command. And these are people that, interestingly enough, not only were they playing key roles in 1961 at the time of the Bay of Pigs, they were also playing key roles at JM Wave in 1963, with Jenkins being the second CIA officer in command of the AmWorld project from the CIA's perspective, and Moore being deputy chief of station for JM Wave, and essentially knowing everybody and knowing everything that was going on, and really writing reports on most of the people at the station. This is someone who David has researched a lot and who shows up in my book, Tipping Point. But these, interestingly enough, the same people that this Villafana was talking to in 1961 as part of the Cuba project, we will find him involved directly with them again in 1963 as he became the prime guy, the prime Cuban, managing a new series of maritime strikes run out of JM Wave called Commando Mambises. And we're sorry to overload everyone with all these new names and all these new actions, but you know, this is really history. History is a lot more complex than you want it to be. You want it to be real simple, but it never is.
A little bit more with Villafana. Again, you get closer and closer to a lot of these CIA military officers. He talked to them. He worked with them, various project operations. And eventually after, you know, the Bay of Pigs failure, he went back to Miami and worked closely with these guys. Special interest is the fact that during the actual landings, this is what Larry went over, he actually led the officers to plead against the cancellation. That was interesting. After their efforts to gain additional airstrikes, Villafana himself, this is as mentioned by Wayne January, flew as a B-26 navigator, participated in the vital ground strike on a large Cuban column which approached the beachhead on April 18th. And this is actually, you can see who he was working with, the action's name. This is in the Bay of Pigs, declassified 2007, I think, by Jack Pfeiffer. It's 5 volumes. It's pretty big.
We really didn't know anything near everything that was written about the Bay of Pigs before the last decade or so was woefully, let's just say it wasn't nearly as accurate as we could make it now. The information released in the CIA's own intelligence studies and the CIA's historians' intelligence studies on the Bay of Pigs largely changes what we now know about Bay of Pigs operations and the whole Cuba project.
Right here's a pretty good picture of at the far right. You got Manuel Villafana. As you can see, he was muscular and interesting crew here. Get the cap. These are the high-level guys for the Bay of Pigs, the Americans. General Doster, who you saw mentioned previously on the previous slide right here. Good, you know, Thorsgood, Doster, Thorsrud, and Villafana all getting together. So the guy next to the writer Villafana is also a really interesting character there, Gustavo Villoldo. If you know the capture of Che Guevara, he was instrumental in doing that. Him and Felix Rodriguez, and he was kind of bad-mouthing Felix Rodriguez for taking all the credit for it. And Villoldo himself said, I know where, I think various pieces of Che are buried. He said, I did the actual burying of him from Bolivia. Again, interesting guy. He was, again, ran some maritime ops also for the JM Wave Station over the years. And a little bit more information for the finer. This is actually from the documentation. And this is actual Villafana actually flew in the strike against the Castro convoy.
So one of the things that makes this interesting again is it's almost an exact corroboration of what January said the pilot told him in Dallas the week before the assassination. It's fascinating that January remembered it that well, and that we can match as many details from his description against what we now know as the true history of Villafana, and no speculation required.
A little bit more after the Bay of Pigs. What were these guys doing?
Mm-hmm.
So he went to JM Wave. He was a paramilitary asset. Came involved with the maritime infiltration and some of the caching missions. These the groups, AM Lilac, AM Tabby groups. They ended up forming Commandos Mambises. You know, a lot of these guys from them were absorbed into it. Maritime missions during 61-62 were overseen by Gordon Campbell, whose pseudonym was Bertrand Jobs. If you ever read Bradley Ayer's The Zenith Secret, you know who Gordon Campbell was. Well, the guy using Gordon Campbell's name in 63. 62 is when Gordon Campbell actually passed away in September. So that's really interesting. Colonel Glenn Rocky Farnsworth is a pseudonym. Campbell, upon his death in September 1962, was succeeded as head of maritime activities by J.M. Waste Station Deputy Chief of Station Robert B. Moore, who's the pseudonym of I'm gonna fix that spelling, huh? Pseudonym of Frederick Inghurst. That is key. Moore himself began to use the name of Gordon Campbell as a cover alias during 63. And it's a little bit speculative, but I think we can make a case that it was Moore himself who was using the pseudonym of Charles Hostinsky while acting as the chief of base for the maritime operations at JM Bar. His maritime operations role, Villafani assisted in recruiting and managing Cuban exiles for his missions from 62 to 68. Personal use in these missions changed from month to month as they either were captured or injuries or interest. They kept pulling people in, kept training new people. They often included members of the DRE's military unit that was supported by the CIA and initially by the DRE's military case officer, David Morales. What was he doing in 63? So a number of those, we mentioned a member of the DRE, and one of the key ones we found is Juan Blanco, longtime CIA assets, also became associated with the DRE, others such as Tony Esquerdo, interesting guy, served in the CIA maritime operations since his missions with Brigade 2506. Again, he was trained by Carl Jenkins, we found out, one of the original cadre going to Panama prior to the Bay of Pigs to be trained to be infiltration. By the end of the summer, Villafani was moved into lead mission of the role of Commandos and Mambises. This was set up by Ted Shackley, David Morales, and the guy that was put in charge of this was Grayston Lynch. So it was an elite group formed to continue the CIA maritime operations, deniable of course, and put pressure on the Castro regime. Personnel for the unit were quartered at CIA safe houses, but not on operations out of Florida ports. And that's just Commandos Mambises.
David, let me break in just with a little commentary. Please. David mentioned Grayston Lynch. Okay, so one of the questions when we get to this point in the presentation, the question is, why are we going into all this detail? We're going into all this detail because we have a Cuban who told Wayne January 3 days before the assassination that his friends were going to kill JFK in Dallas, very specifically in Dallas. And he knew his friends were going to do this largely for revenge for their being deserted by JFK at the Bay of Pigs. Now, so the question that raises is, who the heck are these friends? This is the best insight we have, if this Cuban story is true, that in the fall of 1963, October 1963, he had been working with people who he knew were talking about killing JFK, doing it in Dallas, and that even if he was not involved, he had been associated with these people and knew their motives, knew who they were, knew what they were doing. And one of the significant facts about all of this is who was he involved with in 1963 in that period of time? Who was he doing missions with? Who is he reporting to? And it's significant that Grayston Lynch, in his own book published in the 90s, talks about JFK as being a traitor to the nation, having committed treason, having abandoned the brigade at the Bay of Pigs and sacrificed them. If you were to read his book, the amount of vitriol in his book about JFK is intense. I mean, he clearly hated the man. And this is the guy that Villafana was working for in the fall of 1963.
Larry, it's Neil again. I've got a question from Stuart, if he could just come in at this point.
Yeah, thanks very much, Neil. Yes, David, Larry, one of the things that springs to mind, the FBI were involved in talking to Wayne January after the assassination. Even the CIA would have provided paperwork of some sort. Did Matthew ever understand why Wayne January, A, did not know the colonel, the name of the colonel, but he does say in his book that Wayne January worked alongside the Cuban for 2 or 3 days, got to know him, to like him, even brought food into him, coffee with him. He apparently didn't want to go out and into restaurants and so on externally, but to have worked with a guy for 3 days like that, it seems strange that Wayne January didn't know his name.
He may have known his name and just refused to give it. So go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly the same thing, Stuart. We don't know that he wouldn't have known his name, but I mean, my suspicion would be there's no way the Cuban would have used his true name anyway. First off, we know what January has told us is that neither man introduced themselves. They introduced themselves as the people who were taking the airplane, and that was their role. The officer names were not used as far as January tells us. Now, we don't know that January didn't protect that information. I mean, after all, he protected the identity of the aircraft until after his death. So, Stuart, I can't say that he didn't know names or that names weren't used. I would suspect even if names were not used, they would not be true names, especially for the officer.
Got you.
Larry, David, it's Neil again. Can I ask a question? I mean, given Villafana's military status and his interaction with the agencies, I mean, why do you think he would have revealed so much to Wayne January, who is not a CIA asset as such, happens to just have a business relationship, with the federal government? I get the fact that when you work closely with somebody over a very intense period of time, you do get to know them, and they were obviously reconfiguring this aircraft to fly it out by Thursday or Friday. But it does seem rather odd that someone with his background would be, what's the word I'm looking for, would have just let his guard down and said these things to Wayne. How do you reconcile that?
Well, I reconcile it in 2 ways. A great deal of what he said about his own background, his experience at the Bay of Pigs, were all things that he just said in general conversation. Like, who are you? Who have you been? Talking, I think, with January. The impression that I get was that it was only at a unique moment in time where a newspaper was shown to him talking about the president's visit that he totally lost it. And I want to use this to convey something I'm sincerely convinced about. For the people that were involved in this, for the Cubans that were involved in this, this was not a covert mission in the sense of CIA spy games or covert operation. This was something that was intensely personal, that was intentionally passionate about. For them, it was revenge. And these are passionate people. So I don't think that I think that he made a remark, and actually the way January describes it is that literally it was an outburst. It was an outburst when the subject of Kennedy's visit was brought up. He lost his temper. Basically, he lost it. It was a moment of passion. He stopped talking about it. He didn't talk any more about it, nor did January bring it up anymore after that, few minutes of outburst. And the only other remark was that, again, when he talked to him later in the week, when the Cuban says, well, I told you it was going to happen. So it's not like he talked intensively about it. My take is you're looking at something that was very personal. Has nothing to do with experience, professional, or whatever. This is personal, and it was personal to those guys. They literally hated JFK. The people that were using them for this, other motives, another story, but they hated JFK because he had betrayed them and their cause.
And actually, whilst I've got the floor, and I don't want to rain on your parade with the next lead you're going to get into, but can I just clarify? Did Wayne January only have one interview with the FBI, one visit in which he discussed both the issues, or did he have more than one interview with them?
He only had one interview. He contacted them. They came and interviewed him. He only talked, he did not talk about this subject at all. He only talked about the visitors who had tried to rent an aircraft. It never got to this point, and so there were no further interviews as far as I know.
Okay, and again,
And they never showed him their record of the interview, which is why he never understood, he never realized that they had not even gotten the date for the visit to the airport correctly.
Right. And again, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves here, but you and David mentioned that there was some form of a newspaper article. There was some kind of a newspaper interview. Can you just clarify that? Who was it with? Which paper was it? Galt's or?
I think it was the local Dallas paper. And that was it January, February of '64? He mentioned seeing somebody that looked like Oswald in the car.
Okay,
that's our lead too.
So that interview was, if you like, the less sensitive subject, the lead two thing.
Right. Lead one, he never mentioned until years and years later. He was afraid that he actually worked on the plane that flew out the assassins. That was his big fear. He said, that is a fear that I actually worked on this plane that flew out the assassins.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense then. Yeah, okay. Thank you, David.
Sure. So a little bit, who are the Commandos Mambises? This was an elite group formed by the CIA Maritime Operations, maintained. This is part of the whole autonomous operations. Everything was going to be deniable from April until, through AmWorld. So they're putting pressure on, the Castro regime. Supposedly these weren't CIA at all, but, Castro knew these guys were CIA, Personnel for the unit were from quartered in CIA safe houses, like you mentioned. And IM Lilac team, which was one of the, made up the Commandos Mambises, was run by Grayston Lynch, who we mentioned. Carried out under cover, established by David Morales, which used his own personal contacts to create a fictional offshore origin of the missions. Was it Rafael Pupo Martinez?
Pupo, I think.
Yeah. Was supposedly the guy backing this, and he was like the project manager of this fictional team, but he had nothing to do with it actually. Beginning that summer, extending into the fall of '63, Villafana was assigned supervisory duties over a new series of Commandos Mambises sabotage raids. I think there was 5 in total. Missions, these were mostly very successful compared to a lot of the other ones. And they use, the motherships, the Rex and the Leader, and also the V-20 Swift boats, which we look at a little bit in lead 2, who were some of the people on this V-20 Swift boats. And those missions represented the most significant maritime operations, effective several years, most effective of several years against Cuba. We take a look at Grayston Lynch, who Larry went into a little bit of detail. This is him actually getting appointed. This is from his file. And this was signed by David Morales. So Morales wrote this, saying, I'm putting Grayston Lynch in charge. And this is, the concepts here. I don't know if you want me to read it or I'll give everybody a chance to look at it a little bit. I'll read a little bit of it in case it's kind of hard to read. Again, he's confirmed he's the chief of the AM Lilac Group, Commandos Mambises. These are his instructions. The mission is to adapt current assets into a force which can enter the target area, Cuba, of course, by sea or air to conduct a reconnaissance, caching, sabotage, raids, and guerrilla warfare support operations. These guys were supposed to do it all. The organizational concept to be followed is that of a small teams which can function independently or in combination and entirely under indigenous leadership. Indigenous leadership being Cuban, Manuel Villafana. He was the guy supposedly running it. All personnel should be fully qualified in basic paramilitary skills. These guys, they were trained, some of the earlier guys for the Cuba project. So these guys had skills previously to actually being trained here. Should be physically and mentally prepared to mount operations on short notice. Airborne capabilities will be developed when facilities necessary for training become available. Some of these guys are trained as, paratroopers. Tony Esquerdo is one. He was trained as a paratrooper, and I think landed in Cuba prior to the Bay of Pigs. He was an infiltrator. Also ended up working for Commandos Mambises. The standards for members of the group should be constantly upgraded by culling of members who become marginal or do not develop as expected. They get rid of some of the deadwood here. Recruitment of promising new members will be dependent on the needs of the station based on policy directives. Priority should be given to sabotage training to permit the mounting of sabotage programs at the earliest possible moment. So this is the end. Again, if you're following some of Bradley Ayer's, the Zenith Project, if you read that, I would recommend reading that after looking at some of this. He was hired in May to actually train some of these people. And he came in contact with Morales, who he hated, Grayston Lynch, Rip Robertson, Tony Sforza, a guy he called Gordon Campbell, which was Robert Moore. So these are the people he was dealing with. And again, like I told Larry, if you put the overlay of what Bradley Ayers knew, based upon what we've learned since then, get a pretty good picture of what was going on as part of this and who the people were. And here's just some of the missions and who they were dealing with at the time. Some of this is from Bill Turner. Go ahead.
This would give us the group of people that you would have to look to. Among this group of people, you can't be specific, would be the people that he was associating with, both the CIA officers and the people that were operational with the Mambises mission. His remarks could have come from either direction. Both, for that matter. He could be repeating what he had heard from a CIA officer and know that one or more of the people that had been on his missions were going to Dallas. We will never know that. All we can do is identify the pool of who he could have been talking about.
And you can see the various maritime ships that they used. The Rex was the big one, the leader. Some of the, was it the leader that went on Operation Tilt, Larry?
I think
that was shadowing.
Yes, Alito was shadowing the Tilt mission. They sent one of these ships out to do radar shadowing for the Tilt mission that summer, which Morales and Robertson were directly involved with. But these ships provided cover basically for the Tilt mission ships. And I have to toss this in just because it's part of like 40, 50 years of our history, for just so it's fascinating, and it proves nothing. But the interesting thing is, over the years, when many of us were interacting with Gary Hemming would always imply he knew lots, and you would wonder, well, how did Hemming know anything about anything? Like, okay, he's not part of this cadre, he's not part of this group. The fascinating thing was that he always mentioned the one person that he would identify that was in Dallas and as a shooter was Tony Esquerdo. And it's fascinating to find out that Tony Esquerdo was part of this elite group in Commando Mambises. And not only that, when David turned up the fact that Remigio Arce, one of Hemming's associates, like nobody would have believed they ever did anything real actually went on Commandos Mambisi's missions. It kind of blew my mind.
This is just a list of some of the missions from some of the doc. And who was dealing with Grayston Lynch, Rip Robertson, AM Lilac missions, infiltrations into Cuba, Commandos Mambisi, 61 to 67. Some of their raids and the dates they went on. It's either August, September, October. The underwater these guys were highly trained. Underwater demolition team. And if you notice the November 23rd sabotage operation against the Somme was postponed indefinitely. And this was just, I found an interesting doc that AM Lilac, this is Juan Blanco, and Frederick Inghurst is signing it off as the contracting officer. His real name was Robert Moore. And he gave him a raise. So we kind of look back and say, who were who are the CIA officers embarrassed at the Bay of Pigs? And these people aren't necessarily involved in the assassination, but these were people that were embarrassed. We don't know who was involved. And this is the list of names we came up with. There's probably more we don't know about. But these are our primary list of names. Lynchmore Morales, Carl Jenkins, David Phillips, Howard Hunt, William Kent. Some names you may be new to you, but they show up in some of the documentation. And who were they? And this is just what their roles were at the time. Rip Robertson, him and Lynch at landed Bay of Pigs. Dave Morales in charge of JM Wave operations. William Kent, who was the deputy to David Phillips during the Bay of Pigs, and he was at JM Wave. He actually signed off for George Joanides as his supervisor, and signing off above William Kent was Robert Moore as Frederick Inghurst. So same people, Tom Kleins, Bob Wall, who's David Morales' deputy chief. Cal Hicks is an interesting guy. He's with Task Force W, JM Wave, SAS. He was promoted and replaced by Ernie Sparks. Mickey Capes, Operation Tilt. Who was some of the anti-Castro Cubans. Felix Rodriguez, of course, was JM Wave instructor, translator for Rip Robertson. Members of the DRE, Juan Blanco, and members of the AM Lilac team, who we still don't know exactly who they were. All of them still doing research. And this was an example of one of the people that I'm sure everybody knows who David Morales is, what he was actually talking about. And this is the actual YouTube video where Ruben Cabajal actually says about the conversation he had with David Morales. This is just a small quote from it. Why do you go back on his word? They're still talking about the air support. These people are still pissed about it years and years later. I have no respect for the Kennedys. He said, I was in Dallas when we got that motherfucker. So, and that is the end of this presentation, lead one. Larry, anything you want to cover before we do questions?
No, I think we're ready for questions. I know it's a lot of names, a lot of background. Sorry for that, but that's where it led us.
Larry, David, I've got a question that's come from Pete, but I wanted to add to it as well, actually. Just in terms of the aircraft leaving Dallas at the end of the week, did Villafana sign for it? Was there any paperwork that was conducted to release the aircraft? Was that necessary? Was there a flight path going? I think it went to Houston, didn't it? Was that the plan?
It's
Go ahead, Larry.
What actually happened
It's
there
a-
in terms of the bureaucracy once it was reconfigured and it left? And when did it actually leave?
Well, first of all, here's the paperwork. Okay, but here's the problem. The paperwork involves 3 or 4 different elements, and the paperwork is signed off on by the technical personnel at Red Bird, who accepted the engines, accepted the airframe, accepted the modifications to the aircraft. The Cuban could have not have done that. The Cuban was simply accepting it in a physical, I'm going to fly this thing out once I'm comfortable that all the paperwork is done. So yeah, there are a lot of signatures on the transfer of the aircraft. The aircraft itself was legally transferred to the Houston Air Center. Okay, it was not transferred to a company, it's transferred to the Houston Air Center and stayed legally transferred to the Houston Air Center for almost 3 years. What it was doing physically, we have no idea about. The paperwork shows that after those 3 years, it was legally transferred to a Mexican airline. Okay, what it was doing after it left Red Bird, there's absolutely no record. It's off the books, basically. One of the reasons it's off the books is the paperwork shows that it was not classified as a regular transport aircraft. It was classified as an experimental aircraft, which means it had no, that had to be changed when it was sold to the Mexican airline company and went back into commercial service. But so there is a paper trail, but it's a legal paper trail that shows you the FAA inspections from people that are FAA certified. It shows you the loans that were involved in financing the aircraft. The only reason I have this is that at a point in time when I was writing about this, Matthew had passed away by the time. I made contact with an FAA inspector who was good enough to really dig into this subject and obtain, once we had the tail number for the aircraft, obtain all the paperwork on the aircraft. So there is a paper trail, but as you would expect in a cover operation, the paperwork is all legal and financial and official and shows you nothing about the people actually flying the aircraft or taking it away. Where the aircraft went after that, it could well have gone to Mexico. We know that the officer that we think was involved, Chavez, was making trips to Mexico at that time. He had had a formal coordination role during the Cuba project era with operations that were covertly using Mexican Air Force bases to support the Cuba project. Those same bases were going to be used to support AmWorld. The aircraft could have gone to Mexico. The aircraft could have gone to Houston Air Center to be used for AmWorld. It could have gone anywhere. There's no flight log associated with it. The tower at Red Bird simply logged arrivals and departures of aircraft. It's like they come, they go. That's all we have a record of. So as much as we'd like to have something operational in the paper record, we don't.
Okay. So just to clarify, from a legal perspective, it was bought and sold, and the paperwork was in place, and it arrives, and it's then reconfigured from a troop carrier to a cargo type of aircraft. And those few days, the Cuban and January are just working on that configuration to then have it fly out by the end of the week. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's absolutely a fair statement. All the Cuban is really doing is, he and the officer were both familiar with this kind of aircraft. So all the Cuban is really doing is going through a checklist and seeing that all the modifications have been made that January was asked to do. That's what he's really doing. He's checking the engines, but he's not going to be doing the paperwork to sign it off because he can't. He's not a certified, he doesn't have an FAA. He's just a guy, quite frankly, who knows the aircraft and can fly the aircraft for that matter, because he has experience with the aircraft. So yeah, Neil, your characterization is right on.
Right. So to complete that reconfiguration of the aircraft, there's not a governmental entity such as the FAA that has to sign off on that work in 1963. It's just done privately between the new buyers and the intermediary, let's call it Wayne January, and then it goes. That there's no kind of approval process for that reconfiguration, that everything is in great working order. The Cuban is a professional, Wayne January is a professional. It's a private matter between them for those few days. There's no entity signing off on that at all.
Yeah, what you have are a series of signatures from actual people who work for January at Red Bird, who have FAA certificates to sign off on power plants and other aspects of the aircraft. So I've got their signatures. They signed off on that. They had nothing to do with the transfer. The people that sign off with the transfer for the legal transfer of the aircraft are at Houston Air Center. And I will tell you, and again, this happened after Matthew had passed away. I actually contacted Houston Air Center, talked to a historian who was very happy to talk to me and talk about what the Air Center did, until I actually gave him the tail number of the aircraft. And at that point in time, there was no more communication.
So there was some kind of flag at the Houston Air Center that this is an aircraft that has got a backstory, and we don't talk about it. Yeah. Is that essentially what happened?
It is. And Matthew himself had independently talked to people who said that it was well known that Houston Air Center was a cover operation, that it processed aircraft that were being used for covert activities. It was a paperwork center, basically.
Gotcha. And just to confirm, you were saying that air traffic control just logged when aircraft came in and when they went out. That was it. No flight plan logged. What time did the aircraft actually leave in the end? Do you know?
It shows as flying out. It just says afternoon, basically. It departed at, I'm not sure that I remember actually even a time on it. It just says, DC-3 departed Red Bird Field, that's it.
Gotcha.
And to wait for the teams to get there so they can fly them out.
Obviously, that was
Matthew. Going with that one.
Yeah, that was Matthew's speculation. I could be, could not be. I tend to think that's an awful risky way to run a covert operation. If I was extracting people from Dallas, I would take them out individually in cars. I wouldn't gather them all together. Let's add a little bit to that. There were actually Dallas police officers that worked at Red Bird Airfield part-time. There was the Dallas police officer working there that afternoon that we know, and Red Bird received an advisory not to do a ground stop. No ground stops were done, but kind of like, we need to notify you that this is going on. And the officer did inquire into one flight that left Red Bird and came back that afternoon. That was for a private plane. But, that's a pretty high profile, risky way to extract your team.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. There is another question from the floor. Matt Humphreys wants to ask a question.
I think most of my questions already been answered from the way the conversation continued. There is something that does interest me, that why would the CIA / DRE or whoever be sourcing old planes within the United States? Surely that would leave a trail which could it be embarrassing. I mean, DC-3 is an old plane by 1963. Could they not have sourced them from Mexico or somewhere else?
Well, I think, okay, the answer to the question is by 1963, this was a standard practice for the CIA's own air unit, simply because there were a ton of World War II era aircraft, which this had been built for the war, quite frankly, that were available all across the United States, and they had cover companies here to do it. Okay, that they had all of the equipment basically for the AmWorld project, for example, were so sourced through cover companies in Florida. The boats were. So to answer your question is, it's not that they could not have done it, but once you start going overseas, you know, it requires new contacts, new contracts. Plus, these were the aircraft that people were familiar with. You know, all the aircrafts in the Cuba project itself had come from World War II American military inventory. So the best I can answer on your question is that this was standard practice, and they weren't just getting these aircraft for this. They were buying these same aircraft were going to the Congo and had been going to the Congo for 2 years for CIA operations in the Congo. They were going to Vietnam and Laos for COVID, you know, an overall sourcing package, really. And I don't have the paperwork to prove it, but I think January intimated to Matthew that over 2 or 3 years, he had processed several aircraft of this type.
Okay, thank you.
Just a side note, some of the Swift boats that ended up going to Nicaragua as part of AmWorld eventually went to the Congo, and they were shipped over by, you know, big planes that the CIA had, you know, able to use. In one of the major maritime vessels that they used was called the Joanne. And I always found it was very interesting that on 11/22/63 at 8:30 at night, you have the chief of Panama City Station, Jake Easterling, talking to David Morales, saying, "Oh yeah, did we get the boat, and where is it?" So why would they be doing that? And was there something more? I always found something suspicious in that particular document. And
if there was somebody suspicious, I suspect they ended up on a boat, not a plane.
Yeah, and we know that 9 people ended up on that boat, and they were left below decks quietly. Actually, CIA document called the Black 9. If you ever want to look at that, that has, all right, we have 9 people below decks, you know, exfiltrate, literally they use the term exfiltrate, from Baltimore Harbor, end of November. So always found that an interesting doc. And they were bound for AmWorld. Costa Rica, I think, is actually where they ended up, the boat ended up going. It was used as part of the AmWorld.
Okay, thank you, David. Also, Scott has got a question for you.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. It's kind of similar to what Matthew was saying, and you may have touched on it as the conversations progressed. And again, it calls for a bit of speculation, but I just wondered if you're looking at the bigger picture, if you had any view on where Oswald fit into all of this, if indeed he did fit into it at all. I mean, you mentioned that it would be a risky way to fly out assassins on one plane. I mean, could Oswald potentially have been the person that was supposed to fly out on that plane and point finger at him, and you know, and you know, point America towards a war with Cuba? I mean, again, it's speculation, but I just wondered if you had a view on that when you were, you know, putting the work together.
Oh, we do actually, Scott, and that will come up in lead number 2 as to where we think Oswald tied into Red Bird and what Oswald thought was going to happen on November 22nd. And our speculation is that Oswald did indeed think that he was going to fly out on a private plane, very possibly from Red Bird, not on this plane, but not on a large transport, but on a private plane that had been leased from Ray January. And that, quite frankly, was the story that lies behind the original report from January about people trying to lease an aircraft for a long distance flight, and Oswald being in the car when the aircraft was being negotiated.
Okay, guys. Well, can we just, before we go on to lead 2 and the whole Oswald and all the other rabbit holes, could we just have a comfort break, a drink break or something just for 5 minutes?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Fine with me. I'm going for pizza.
It's a little early for pizza, Larry.
Yeah.
Never too early for pizza.
All right, we'll reconvene in 5. Thanks.
Okay, see you in 5.
Was everybody going for taking a break? For some milk. Good. Count. For the break, aren't
David, how are you doing?
Fine. How are you doing, Pete?
Yeah, fine. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. I've been meaning to give you a ring.
Yeah. Touch base again.
Yes, I know. It's really nice to see you. That's Pete.
Old Trafford.
Right. Okay, guys, are we all back in situ?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I should have. I've been rather amateurish. I should have paused the recording there, shouldn't I? That was silly. Okay. Larry, David, are you back?
Yep, I'm back. David's back.
Okay. All right.
Right.
We should probably
Larry-
wait.
Yeah, Larry's making pizza, I think so.
Making it, or I mean,
Both making
Oh.
and consuming.
I better pause it for about 30 minutes then.
Yeah.
Well, I'm back.
Okay, that's great, Larry. Thanks.
Pizza.
Okay, well, David, do you want to restart and everybody else mute, please?
See my screen okay?
Yes, thanks, David.
Sure.
Mm.
Larry, how's the pizza?
It was great. I only had time for a couple of pieces, but it'll keep for a little while longer.
All right. All right. So this was lead number 2, based upon the original Wayne January report. I'll let Larry go into quite a bit of detail, but this is what we've got from Wayne January and what he actually said about the original one. Approached by a young man and a woman, couple's not well dressed. They were in an older car. He recognized that because I think he used to have one of the similar year. There was also another young man that remained in the vehicle. And the request was for a plane and a pilot for a long flight. And January's immediate concern was that this plane could be hijacked to Cuba. Again, I think there was quite a few of planes being hijacked way back in the day, if I remember right. Larry, do you want to start off on any of this?
You bet. Yeah. And it would be lovely to know, you can always think of 100 questions that you wish that you would ask. And I don't know that actually Matthew explored why he thought that these people might, want to hijack the aircraft or why they would hijack it to Cuba. Was it something about their appearance? Was it something about their accent? Why he would relate it to Cuba? Clearly he was curious, based on their car and their dress, they, would they have enough money? That might have created some suspicions because they weren't his typical rental or leasing customer. And I think the other thing that triggered it is usually he leased aircraft, for training or and he leased it to someone who was going to fly the aircraft or had their own pilot. These folks wanted a pilot, and it suggested to him that they actually wanted him to pilot the aircraft. So he was personally wondering, it's kind of like, well, not only might the aircraft be hijacked per se or taken to Cuba per se, but they may force me to fly them to Cuba. So there was that element that certainly really got his attention. they also made a big deal of the fact that it would be a long flight, that they talked to him about the range of the aircraft, how much fuel could it carry. I think there was maybe some intimation that they wanted to, that they were going on their honeymoon. There was something, they were going to the Yucatan, but clearly they were interested in not just making some kind of a local charter flight, but that it was a long distance overseas flight. So that really set it up in his own mind as something special. Back to you, David.
Sure. This is what Larry mentioned earlier. January reported to the incident to the FBI, based it on occurring only days before the assassination and the resemblance to Oswald. And as Larry mentioned earlier too, the FBI report placed incident months earlier, back into the summer of '63. Pursued questions about January and about visits to the Carousel Club. Do you know Jack Ruby? So he knew right away he shut it down. And there's no effort to investigate suggestion of any conspiracy, perhaps due to the FBI's misrecording of the date of the incident. And the disconnect in dates investigated and brought to January's attention by Matthew Smith, which we mentioned earlier, when January never saw the document itself. When Matthew Smith actually brought it to him, he goes, "No, this is wrong." He said, "They just misstated it." And the time of incident does match a day when Oswald was reported having been unusually late for breakfast. He was in a bad mood and he was not at work that day. That was the diner incident, where you had breakfast every morning. Usually by 7:30 he was having breakfast, and we ended up having breakfast that day. Was it Wednesday, if you remember? Larry, and he made a big stink. And it was around 10:30 in the morning. And that's when J.D. Tippett supposedly was there at the same time, which was interesting.
It would be one of the things that would be lovely if we had an actual, could specifically say Oswald was not at work that morning at the School Book Depository. Unfortunately, all the research shows us that basically all you could say about an employee being at work was they were recorded at work as on a given day, primarily because the supervisor that they reported to would note that they were in the building and working, and just make a note. It's kind of like, yeah, they're here and they're at work. There's no specific date. And he might only see them even a couple of times during the day because they would be working on different floors or not around him. So we know that Oswald was at work that day. We have no idea when he showed up, and that he could not have showed up late in the morning.
Right. There was no clock to punch. They didn't have to sign in or, check in with your supervisor. You just showed up for work. That's what we found out when we did the research on that.
So David, that was from the Secret Service report, wasn't it? The lack of a time clock, and
yes.
The supervisor just marked it down in the book. Would that be Shelley? Would that be Fraser, Lovelady? Who would that have been at the time, do you think?
Pretty sure it would be Shelley.
Shelley, yeah.
Okay.
Just get in there, go to your floor and start doing your work. So what we got, I think we had referenced that in the actual paper itself, Larry. I think the actual document.
Yeah. So the bottom line is, January could not swear that it was Oswald. He thought it looked enough like Oswald for him to, make this a story, to be significant, and, to expose himself, because frankly, we all understand there were a lot of people that might or might not have seen Lee Oswald prior to November 22nd. And the last thing they would want is any visibility whatsoever. So it was really rather brave on January's part, and he must have thought it significant enough to really expose himself by relating this story. Certainly he was not as you can imagine, here's a guy who is on the side processing aircraft for the CIA. You know, this is not a publicity seeker.
All right, next slide. I'll have so Mr. Hancock go into some detail about this one. Oswald, you know, there's a lot has been made about his actually wanting to go to Cuba, and it was a long time wish of his to actually get there. There's quite a bit of documentation there. During his time in the Marines, you know, Oswald talked of going to Cuba, joining the revolution against Batista. He was an early supporter of Fidel, you know, believing that he was a liberator before everybody knew he was a communist. He also contacted the Cuban consulate in LA and obtained literature from them. Summer 63, while in New Orleans, Oswald talked with his wife about hijacking aircraft to fly in Cuba. Again, this is documented in our paper, the actual Marine actually saying what he did. He had maps, how to get there. He put quite a bit of detail in actually how to get to Cuba and actually hijacking it. So we're wondering if he actually mentioned some of this to some of his people, Oswald's contacts while he was in New Orleans, and they picked up on it. We don't know. Speculation at this point. Marina refused to help him with any hijacked effort, but agreed to join him in Cuba if he did make it there. Oswald did, what we know, he did obtain a Mexican tourist visa, and he showed every sign of desiring to travel to Cuba in some fashion, whether it was through Mexico City or hijacking a plane, with the pretext of returning himself and Marina to Russia. And as early as his time in New Orleans, Oswald had begun building an image and credentials demonstrating his support for Cuba in the Castro regime. Was that a ploy? There's a lot going on here. What Oswald was actually doing in New Orleans at the time. Was it part of an op? Was he being, influenced to do certain things? Again, there's a lot of research on that possibly he was. Larry, comments?
Yeah, I think so. Put this in the context. If we assume that January is telling the truth, if we assume, and these are assumptions for researching any lead. We assume January is telling the truth. We assume that it was that the people showed up. If we assume that it was Lee Oswald, one of the things that immediately introduces to this is the fact that as of November 1963, Oswald would have been communicating with people who had heard that he wanted to go to Cuba, who knew he had an interest in doing that, and who were maintaining some kind of contact with him all the way from New Orleans to Dallas on the possibility of helping him get to Cuba. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean these were Cuban spies or Cuban agents. In fact, there's a case to be made otherwise. But the point is, if we accept January's story, it does put us in the mode of Oswald being in contact with and manipulated by people and to some extent following their directions in terms of how they might help him get to Cuba ultimately. And certainly the significant fact would appear that this continued to merely days before the assassination, in which Oswald was, we don't know what they would have told Oswald. For all we know, they told him that they'd actually rented the aircraft. We don't know that this contact with January was nothing but basically a scam to influence Oswald, convince him that they'd rented an aircraft and that they were going to fly him out to Cuba. We have no idea. It's pure speculation of what they could have told him. Well, all that we can say is if that was Oswald at Red Bird, clearly in his mind, the week of the assassination was that he was going to fly out of Dallas with some other people who would arrange for a private aircraft and a pilot to take him where he really wanted to go, which would have been Cuba. And by the way, which the aircraft would have been capable of doing, because specifically they were looking to rent an aircraft with that kind of range and fuel capacity. So back to you, David.
Sure. Looking at what,
David,
go
sorry,
ahead.
just before you just press on, Matthew wants to ask another question.
Yeah, hopefully I haven't missed something. Did Wayne actually identify Oswald as being one of those three people?
He didn't say it was Oswald. He said he looked like Oswald and resembled Oswald. He didn't say it was, because he didn't know Oswald at that time.
No, that's
after-
fair enough. But
Yeah.
but one of those people definitely looked like Oswald. So it wasn't
Absolutely.
just
Based,
So we're not
based on him seeing
equating.
the news coverage.
Okay, yeah. What I wanted to make sure is that we're not equating three random people and trying to make it more than it is. He actually said it did look like Oswald.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure. Right. Looking at who was Oswald dealing with during the summer of '63 and other people probably in New Orleans at the time. Again, multiple sources reported Oswald being in contact with locally unknown Cubans in New Orleans during this time. FBI sources submitting reports on those contacts were harshly rebuked, and the FBI failed to investigate the reports, which later became an initial focus for the Garrison investigation. Like who were these people that Oswald was talking to? I mean, there's a lot of unknowns. Tall guys, Mexican looking, muscular, and a lot of these people are not, Carlos Quiroga or Carlos Bringuer. So who were these other people? We don't know. We can guess and speculate, but some of the later inquiries did document that Miami Cubans were in New Orleans area that summer and working on that abortive DRE Cuba bombing effort. We know who they were and what they were doing. Interesting group of people. Some of the individuals, going to New Orleans for the DRE included Carlos Hernandez and Victor Espinosa Hernandez. These guys are both, operational paramilitary guys since the early Cuba project, trained by Carl Jenkins, Rip Robertson, the various crew. And Carlos Hernandez ended up, training the DRE on paramilitary operations. They actually were assets CIA in '62, going to Helsinki with the, again, very tight, small group of members of the DRE at that time. And Hernandez himself was recruited in September of '63 to become a member of the AmWorld Project and a member of Quintero's commandos. That was the actual term they used. There was, I think, 10 of them. They actually worked together in 1960, 61. Chichi Quintero and Carlos Hernandez were close. They were friends. Went on missions together, trained together. Victor Espinosa, again, that's Carlos Hernandez considered him his best friend. During the summer of '63, they're hanging out together. They trained together in Panama, and then went to New Orleans, JM Move, where they were actually trained there as part of an elite infiltration team, along with Miguel Alvarez and a bunch of others. And you see Miguel Alvarez, Carlos Hernandez, Victor Espinosa Hernandez, all part of that Cuba bombing effort out of New Orleans at the McClaney Ranch. So interesting group of people. I tend to wander too much here sometimes. Larry, anything before we go on? Did I miss?
Yeah, so to simplify matters, again, if these are assumptions that actually we know for sure, he was talking to unknown Cubans in New Orleans that the local Cubans did not know, okay? FBI informants say that. He was seen associating with them. Pino is an example, the bartender. He's hanging out with these Cubans. We know it. We don't know who these people are. They're not from in town. They're not. So, and the interesting thing is that David and I have researched a group of Cubans who did go to New Orleans, the New Orleans area, in exactly that same time frame. The interesting thing is that when Oswald contacted Bringuer to support the DRE military effort, Bringier said, no, we don't do that here. I'm going to have to refer you to the DRE military people. The DRE military people would be the ones that you want to talk to and volunteer with. Interestingly enough, the people that show up in New Orleans at exactly the right time after that are Carlos Hernandez, who was a senior commander in the DRE military group. So again, speculative, but it would have been a logical transfer to have these guys from Miami who were in the area anyway, get in contact with Oswald and establish a contact directly between the DIRE folks in Miami and Lee Oswald. As it turns out, that's not the only contact that's established between folks in Miami and Lee Oswald at that point in time. That's another part of the story. But so this is a connection of mysterious Cubans that we can document with guys coming from New Orleans and spending a limited amount of time in the area as outsiders in exactly the time frame under question.
Okay, next slide. We're looking at Oswald and the context with the DRE's contacts. We know we first contacted the DRE in New Orleans, and the contact was reported to DRE headquarters in Miami. That was, Carlos Bringier reported it to right away to the DRE headquarters. The DRE contact with Oswald was also circulated to other. This was based upon Jeff Morley's excellent article when he actually interviewed Luis Fernandez and Juan Salvat in Miami about their early days, and they said, yeah, we got the information about Oswald. We sent it to Alpha 66, all our contacts, throughout the anti-Castro exile groups in Miami. Said this, he was well known. He was no stranger. Everybody knew about him. Said it was a virtual certainty the contact would have been reported to Jamwave case officer George Joanides. Definitely would have known about it. And also all the SIS personnel at JMWave. Besides that, we know that Joanides was reporting to William Kent. Kent was reporting up to Robert Moore. And actually, these guys signed off on Joanides' fitness report for 6 months up until September of '63. We don't have his other reports yet, though. Jeff Morley's been looking at those for years. Both the DRE and the CIA refused to acknowledge any contact with or monitoring of Oswald after the initial contact in New Orleans. Yeah, you're not going to see those reports. Again, multiple legal efforts. 99% of the efforts were done by Jeff Morley, trying to get these documents released. Still fighting the battle with Joanides and the DRE contact reports. Larry, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think this takes us into an interesting tack. And I know I feel bad about this, and we've already been with you guys for ages, it seems like. But if you really want to study this in detail, you have to hang in there and look at the fact that at this point in time, as of September, end of August, September, lots of people in Miami know about Lee Oswald. Among the Cuban exile groups, DRE had actually started their own propaganda campaign against Lee Oswald. They were writing to Congress people and wanting Lee Oswald to be investigated because he represented exactly the sort of threat that Castro, gullible young Marine, now Castro supporter, now doing leafleting and on the air promoting Castro. It was great propaganda material for the DRE, would have been great propaganda material for the CIA. As a matter of fact, DRE expressed the fact that they were excited about using Oswald as a propaganda tool because that's what the CIA was paying them to do by that point in time. That was their main mission. And as David expressed, the fact that suddenly when Oswald leaves New Orleans, the fact that DRE would just not even be interested in where he went what he was doing, any further opportunity to use him for propaganda is ridiculous. And certainly explains why those reports that Jeff wants to get are not going to be shown to us. But the thing is that the CIA Miami station, Fitzgerald's special affairs staff, also knew about Oswald, knew about his propaganda value. So there was a very good possibility that Oswald was the fit for what DRE was doing with propaganda, and for that matter, what JM Wave was doing in terms of propaganda and counterintelligence. So at that point in time, Oswald becomes a perfect vehicle for a lot of things that are going on out of the JM Wave station in Miami.
Yeah, it's just, again, a little bit of speculation here. I believe that one of the reasons we won't see the reports also is Richard Helms himself was getting copied on Joe and Edie's reports. So if he's getting reports from the DRE, they're going to Richard Helms. And he didn't want that known, and they're still covering it up, I believe, to this day. Helms had met with, again, Louis Fernandez from the DRE, November '62, right after the Cuban Missile Crisis. The DRE, these guys were wild at the time, spreading a lot of information that the Soviets are still there. They still have nuclear weapons, their missiles. So Helms met with a couple of guys, Fernandez himself, and said, calm down, we're going to replace, your current officer was Ross Crozier at the time, with a new guy. And by December of '62, they replaced him with Joe and Edie's. And he said, I'm going to keep an eye on him, eye on you guys and what's going on. I'm involved. So you get Helms himself involved with the DRE. So pretty high level. Just try and go down that rabbit hole a little bit there. And get back on track. McEwen, some of the incidents Oswald was involved in, interesting. McEwen incident in Houston, I'm not sure if you're aware of that. It was after to buy weapons from, Castro-associated weapons. He's an interest. Larry, do you have some background on Robert McEwen?
Yeah, just to make a transition here, Robert McEwen had been a weapons dealer for the revolution against Batista. He had actually been a gun runner, moved weapons out of New Orleans into Cuba to support the revolution. He had become well known to Castro personally. Castro had actually taken the trouble after the revolution when he was at the UN in the US. He took a side trip to Houston to actually personally meet with McEwen, to give him thanks, to invite him to come to Cuba and be part of the new government in Cuba. And this all made newspaper headlines. If there was one American, that you could associate with Castro and Cuba as of, post-assassination, McEwen was one of them. He would if you wanted to, interestingly enough, if you wanted to establish a connection between a radicalized Lee Oswald and Cuba, a great thing to do would be to somehow put Lee Oswald in contact with McEwen, which is exactly what appears to have happened.
Yeah. And who was he with, right? He was with a guy calling him that McEwen recognized as Hernandez, that he'd seen him in Cuba when he sold weapons to Castro and Adame, and back when they were working together. And who was with Adame back then was part of the Ruales Commandos, the Rural Commandos, Carlos Hernandez, Chichi Quintero, Tony Esquerdo, the same people. So find it interesting.
It's also interesting that one of the Cubans who was actually arrested, charged, and convicted for gun running into Cuba, we have his name because he's in the arrest records, turns out to be a personal friend and operational revolutionary participant with none other than Carlos Hernandez.
Was it Jorge Sotis, I think, Larry?
I think that's correct, yes. See, I told you guys, David remembers all the names. I'm an old guy, I don't.
Yeah. So, I mean, there is that connection. Also, there was the Miami incident involving a young Cuban in the living room of a former Havana casino operator involved in DRE bombing missions, who described his friend Lee, who had been in Russia, was an expert shot and now in either Mexico or Texas. That is Martinez Soto, Larry?
Yes. Yep. The point of all this is after Oswald leaves New Orleans, there are a lot of things going on that might lead you to suspect that people in Miami know about Lee Oswald, know that Lee Oswald is going on, you know, that the DRE truly did not stop monitoring Oswald, you know, the day he left New Orleans, that there's an ongoing contact, that they're very possibly manipulating him for propaganda value. They're going to be building a case against him. He's now, when they visited McAllen, the interesting thing is they wanted to buy guns, and they wanted to buy guns, you know, with this young guy, this Oswald, let's say. The whole purpose of the visit is to buy guns to support a new revolution in Central America. And at the time, we have Richard Helms trying to convince Jack Kennedy that, you know, the Cubans are just shipping arms in and trying to set up new, you know, the storyline goes together quite well. You know, if it had ever gone that direction, like Lee Oswald has been co-opted by the Cuban drive to export his revolution into Central America, so we need to like invade Cuba, whatever. But it's an interesting storyline that could be put together.
And of course, there's the famous Odio incident where the Leon Oswald and two Cubans visited her, and they described Oswald as being an expert marksman who could kill either Castro or JFK. But you know, it's a lot of information on that out there.
One of the fascinating things to me is that David, who digs far more deeply than I have, has now determined that, interestingly enough, Carlos Hernandez in the summer of 1963, in addition to all his other activities with, you know, bombing missions, CIA maritime missions, was actually, he had so much free time, apparently, he was hanging out with a group that was actually associated with Jure and Ray. So it actually, if it were Carlos Hernandez, and David and I suspect it was, who showed up at Odio's, the fact that he might be representative himself as coming from Jure is really interesting, because quite frankly, he had been.
That is true. We suspect Leopoldo was a friend of his too.
You know, I'm feeling guilty, David, because when I look at the screen and I see Pete kind of holding his head in his hands, it's like, what are you people doing with me? I feel guilty. Yeah, but
Larry,
Pete, even though I'm doing the same thing. I just have my screen turned off.
you shouldn't feel guilty. We've had 4 or 5 hour sessions on Zoom. This is entry level stuff at the moment.
Carry on the lobotomy, Larry.
Okay, David, you have permission to continue, you know,
right,
hurting them.
Let me yeah, I'll speed it up a little bit. DRE backstory, you know about them, you know, the student directorate group was organized following the disaster of the Bay of Pigs. Some of these guys were used earlier, and they actually met with David Morales and William Kent, who we mentioned before. We had Juan Salvat, actually, Manuel Juan Salvat actually met with him back in 1960. They had highly public, you know, military and propaganda efforts. These guys were young and cutting edge way back then. They were very well known. They're extremely autonomous, which was the CIA had a problem with, and they were getting out of control beginning of 62 and into 62, like I mentioned earlier with the around the Cuban Missile Crisis. You know, there's fear that they could actually cause issues with the Russians and escalating the whole conflict itself back then. Efforts to restrict the DRE, they're mentioned there, condemnation of the CIA, even threats against its personnel. they did not like the CIA at all, generally as an organization. Despite the senior DRE associated paramilitary personnel still engaged in CIA maritime missions, some of these guys liked working for the CIA. Some of the paramilitary guys, because there there's action, But here's some of the individuals we mentioned working together for some time, both DRE propaganda and the military. It was Salvat Hernandez, John Cook, Jean, and Ana Diaz Silveira. Anything you want to add, Larry, before we go into the loose connection?
I guess just as a little bit of a teaser, if someone were going to take this somewhere like to Red Bird Airport and have two people show up with Lee Oswald at Red Bird Airport, setting in up for a flight to Cuba, one of them's going to have to be female. It was a man and a woman. So somewhere you're going to have to find a person of interest who would fit the female character as well.
All right, I'm going to let you go with this one, Larry. I know you did a lot more research on this than I did.
Oh, okay. All right. We'll throw into another tangent just to drive everybody nuts. Okay. To give a bit more background on DRE and to bring in something else that helps tie this picture together in the end, because all these are individual threads that when I first looked at them were interesting, but made no sense until this one lead begins to bring them together. Is the fact that in addition to its CIA connections, and the DRE also had a connection to Claire Booth Luce and to William Pauley and to the real right wingers, basically, who wanted to support much more aggressively the Cuban exile activities and much more overtly and visibly than the Kennedy administration did. And DRE managed to get an introduction to Mrs. Luce. And of course, Henry Luce ran the largest media network in the United States. So it was a wonderful propaganda and public outlet for the DRE's story about a war against Castro. And Luce actually had individual conversations with DRE military leaders. One of the threads that enters into all of this at the time of the assassination is that on the evening of November 22nd, Mrs. Luce received a telephone call from one of the people that she had known earlier, a DRE military leader, who was calling her and immediately wanted, like the Luce media network, to jump all over Lee Oswald as a Castro agent and the assassination being a Castro conspiracy, because they had all sorts of information about Lee Oswald that they wanted to supply, including the fact that Lee Oswald had been in Mexico and Lee Oswald had been working with a Castro assassination team operating out of Mexico. And they were excited about this. I mean, they were really, she relates, this was extremely important. They had this unique information. And to some extent, it was unique, because I will tell you, as the evening of assassination and for some time afterwards, there was nobody talking about Lee Oswald in the media being in Mexico. And this may have been another slip equivalent to the Cuban pilot at Red Bird that should not have been made when they were promising, someone calling from the DRE that night, promising to have been monitoring Lee Oswald in Texas and Mexico and in contact with a Cuban assassination team operating out of Mexico, and even offering to provide documentation on all this. Something that after a certain point in time, wait a minute, these people should not have known this. They should have not have had this information unless they knew a lot more about Lee Oswald than they would ultimately admit to. So there's a very interesting Luce Pauley connection here that just is suggestive of the fact that DRE was doing something with and around Lee Oswald after his departure from New Orleans. Back to you, David.
All right, go down a little bit of a rabbit hole. I won't go too far. about the recordings of Oswald bragging he could kill anyone. Of course, you know, they had the Bringier. Everybody knows about him in the debate and the recordings. Bringier's good friend was Ernesto Rodriguez. Supposedly his mother-in-law threw him under the bus and said he had recordings of Lee Oswald, and that they were acquaintances. Oswald, you know, went to the Berlitz School in New Orleans met with Ernesto Rodriguez about taking Spanish lessons. That much is documented. So there was an acquaintance, you know, with Ernesto Rodriguez. What is really interesting is Ernesto Rodriguez's brother, Emilio Rodriguez, was CIA JM Wave. He was counterintelligence, covert action, reported to and worked with Tony Sforza, David Morales. So, I mean, there's really a direct connection right there to JM Wave, you know, like Ernesto Rodriguez's brother is, you know, a big shot at JM Wave. So found that interesting. So was that part of the, you know, tapes that were never released due to, you know, they shut it down? You know, so just speculation there, but that's an interesting connection.
It's important to note at the same time that JM Wave is hearing from DRE and its case officers about Lee Oswald, and, you know, other people are hearing from DRE about Lee Oswald, that one of the senior counterintelligence officers at JM Wave is the brother of the guy, the first person contacted by Lee Oswald in New Orleans. Now, I got to tell you, if you think that the brother in New Orleans did not talk to the brother in Miami, I'm afraid you would be very mistaken. That's almost impossible to believe that that was not part of the conversation, because obviously Emilio, being charged with counterintelligence, used his brother and his family in New Orleans, and he had lived in New Orleans himself, to provide him ongoing information about what was happening in the Cuban exile community. So here we have another person who becomes very key in this whole story and who might be a very important player in regard to some counterintelligence activities that evolved around Lee Oswald, if not Lee Oswald personally, Lee Oswald's public image as a Castro supporter, that evolved in Mexico City, because it turns out that Emilio was charged with a massive counterintelligence program targeting Cuban diplomats in Mexico City and at the UN. And there's a link between the two, because the person that he was targeting in New York City just happened to have had a mistress when he had been stationed in Mexico City, and the mistress was none other than, can anyone guess? Mexico City, female, Oswald contact.
Duran.
Sylvia Duran. So Emilio is running an operation against the guy that whose mistress, and they're trying to turn this guy's wife, not him. They're trying to turn his wife into an informant. And so Emilio's running a counterintelligence operation against a Cuban diplomat whose mistress is in Mexico City, who will be approached, quote unquote, by Lee Harvey Oswald. Things just get stranger and stranger.
Yeah.
Okay, David, back to you.
Not to go too far, but if you look at Emilio's close friend and fellow JM Wave guy, Tony Sforza, he was running an operation on, you know, with Winston Scott, trying to recruit Asquay to get him to turn, either before he, you know, went back to Havana or in place. And the guy they sent to do it was Cassis, who was Amat 106, who was good friends with Tony Sforza and Emilio Rodriguez, to recruit him. And shortly after, Oswald shows up in Mexico City, after the recruitment failed. So were they piggybacking upon an existing operation to recruit Asquay? I don't know. That's an interesting point.
Or wild speculation, if they had sent one AMOT to penetrate the Mexico City consulate, could they possibly have sent another AMOT to impersonate Lee Oswald? Just wild speculation.
Right. Or they could have an Emot send a couple of his guys to get Oswald to Mexico City. All right, well, if we're going too far down a couple rabbit holes here, we're losing focus. All right, so who was in Dallas in October of '63? Well, we got Manuel Sabat and Ana Diaz Silveira. What were they doing? They were fundraising, attempting weapon buys. They were giving meetings before the John Birch Society people. There was also a lot of unnamed Cubans who were also involved in meetings in Dallas, making strong statements and even threats against JFK. The DRE leaders were also in Chicago in October for fundraising and weapons buys. They appear to have been a great threat, a threat against JFK, reported the FBI does his home at Echeverria. DRE members were in Dallas in contact with the gunsmith and ammunition dealer, John Thomas Mason. Mason was only one of two sources located by the FBI who sold both full metal jacket and soft nose Carcano ammunition. Larry, you want to go on to anything before we kind of go ahead?
No, to wrap it up, what we're trying to do is develop, again, a picture of what might have come down if essentially Oswald was in play. Oswald was being managed as a useful idiot, manipulated both by the DRE for propaganda purposes. It's very important, as David just mentioned, that Salvat and Ana Diaz and Carlos Hernandez had all been involved in earlier propaganda missions for the CIA. And actually, all their roles in 1963 were as much in regard to propaganda as they were military operations. The fact that all of them likely were in Dallas in October, very possibly in November, is quite interesting. The DRE could have had Oswald in play. JM Wave could have had Oswald in play for propaganda and counterintelligence purposes. There could have been a number of things going around Oswald that he was totally unaware of, and multiple agendas by that matter. And of course, that sets up a situation in which propaganda and counterintelligence operations that were even sanctioned, that show up in those papers that Jeff Morley wants, that show up in the DRE case officer files or the Miami station files, are never going to be released because they show sanctioned operations going on around Lee Oswald, which in the end were hijacked to set him up as part of the as a patsy in the conspiracy. So what we're talking about here is a scenario in which Oswald could have been in play by multiple parties and involving the DRE, the CIA counterintelligence, and all of this would have had, the fascinating thing to me is somebody got away with picturing Oswald as an unknown lone nut. There could not be anyone more widely known as possible within the intelligence community, with his public image. You know, I was stunned when I found that DRE was actually writing letters to Congress about Lee Oswald. Do you see that in the Warren Commission report? Certainly not. Obviously, Jeff opened up a can of worms with Joanides that was, I think, was just, you know, a lot of the stuff probably was destroyed quickly, kind of like the Husty note with the FBI. But there were a ton of things going on out of JM Way around Lee Oswald that had to be immediately held back, which is why one of the fascinating things, it's a side note, another rabbit hole, you've heard David mention Sforza as being a key name in all of this operationally. it was Sforza who was assigned to do the internal investigation at JM Wave after the assassination of the fact of whether or not there could have been any Cuban exiles involved in the assassination. Sforza is assigned to do that. And we know from documents that saying he was assigned to do it. We know some of the questions that were being asked, and the report either never entered into evidence or disappeared when it was all over. So it's fact. And of course, in the end, the CIA officially said, oh, well, no, we never investigated that, but yet we know they did. Okay, David, we probably should be back more focused on who was at Red Bird.
All right,
Yeah.
so, yeah, we're, so. All right, we kind of went over that.
Yeah, why
Any
don't we go
questions?
right down to the,
Using Oswald, who's doing it underground.
well, let's stop for a moment before we, kind of wrap this up on this lead. Any questions at this point about the backstory, the DRE's involvement with Oswald, who some of these people are, what was going on? Yeah, questions at this point?
I have a
I can't,
question.
I was going to say, I can't believe it's that clear. I hardly understand.
I have a question, not directly related to what you just suggested, Larry, but as we're talking the last couple hours, I've known about Red Bird for a long time, and I knew it was not that far from Dallas. It's in Dallas, and it just, maybe it's a stupid question, but which came first, the chicken or the egg? Does the advantage of Dealey Plaza happen first, and then they discover Red Bird, or is Red Bird the key geographic factor in deciding on Dealey Plaza? I mean, when I look at the map here, I see that Red Bird is, by the looks of it, 2 or 3 miles from Oak Cliff. It's in Oswald's backyard. It's 10 miles from downtown Dallas. But does that location become significant in locating Oswald, placing him in Oak Cliff?
I think the location, and this is me, so I won't speak for David. My view of the way the attack evolved in Dallas is very evolutionary, very iterative. It kind of gelled over a period of a matter of weeks as to where Lee Oswald was, where he was working, where he was living. And in the end, the people that went to Dallas, and again, if we believe some of our other sources, they were in Dallas, a week to 2 weeks in advance, working on the logistics. So we know, for example, that Lee Oswald had very likely been impersonated in applying for various jobs up and down Main Street before he got the job at the school book depository. We know that even after Lee Oswald was employed at the school book depository, it appears that he was applying for jobs elsewhere. Would he stay there, whatever. I think the team had to cope with, what was changing on the ground, and then that there probably wasn't a solid plan in the beginning. However, once you had Lee Oswald in place and at the school book depository, once you had him living on his own, separated from Marina, and they didn't get him back together, I think it presented an opportunity to maneuver him by offering him something. And what they offered him was to help get him out of the country, to help him go to Mexico. He could send for Marina and the kids later. Maybe she would come, maybe she wouldn't. But I think they offered him something. whether they ever really intended to fly him out from somewhere, Red Bird or elsewhere, may have not have been the deal. My personal is that Red Bird was ideal to convince Lee Oswald to stay in touch with them, to do what they wanted him to do in a general sense, and to be available to leave Dallas on the afternoon of November 22nd in order to set him up as a patsy. And to that extent, whether or not January rented the plane to them makes no difference. They simply had to take him there, make the effort to rent the airplane, and tell them that it was a done deal. And on November 22nd, while everybody else is looking at what's going on the president's visit, you make your way to Red Bird Airport, and we're good. So I think it was Red Bird was part of a very credible effort to maneuver Oswald as a patsy. Gary, does that?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Or meet your contact at the Texas Theater and then make your way to the airport.
Yeah,
So
and
that could have been.
it's almost walking distance. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but in Oswald's mind, it's like, oh, hey, this is no sweat getting there. It's close.
Yep. Go to the
Whereas,
theater first, right?
whereas any other, and it makes sense. It's real time. It's not like, okay, we're going to take a bus to Mexico again. That didn't work. I've got to, if I'm running this thing, and I often try to put myself, I've got to offer him something so tempting that he kind of stays under my control to some extent. And a flight directly to Mexico from Red Bird, I've gets his attention. If I had just told them, well, we'll help you go to Mexico City by bus and we'll try to smuggle you out or whatever, it's a harder sell.
Right. Thank you.
So are you saying, Larry, that with respect to the patsy thing, that this only really picked up momentum, say, from mid-October?
Correct. I mean, again, not speaking for David, my whole view of the thing is that the conspiracy itself gelled during September and October.
Because, I mean, he didn't, I mean, getting the job at the TSBD, is that, in your view, is that by happenstance, or was that arranged? Because my understanding was Fraser's sister was talking to Ruth Payne, and Fraser worked there, and that's how the introduction occurred, and Ruth Payne rang and he went in to see Truly and so forth. I mean, is that not key to the start of this?
To my way of thinking, I'm very simplistic. Okay, I'm a reductionist. I'll admit this, and everybody will hate it. So that's just a disclaimer. The key to framing Oswald was the rifle. And I know that's going to upset people, but the point is, if I have a rifle found in the vicinity of the shooting that's traceable to Lee Oswald, he's at best an accessory, if not a shooter. And Lee Oswald, by his history, links to Cuba and Castro. So that's a minimalist view. Wherever having that in the school depository is fascinating. If I can plant something, that gets him in the building, his employee, great. But quite frankly, there were half a dozen people interviewed, and I can show you the interviews, who reported Lee Oswald looking for a job on Main Street, where the motorcade was undoubtedly going to pass, and talking about views and talking, these people went to the FBI afterwards and were very serious. And when you look at his interviews, you see that they shut them down. They pushed back. They wanted no indication that there were Lee Oswald or anyone else had been looking at different locations where he might have had a job or might have been linked to. So Neil, I guess my answer is, I don't know that we'll ever know. I will know that if you had wanted to frame Lee Oswald and you had managed to get possession of his gun, the minimalist view is it's just a matter of using his quote unquote legend and putting that gun where it's going to be found in conjunction with a shooting. wherever it is.
Okay, so when you were talking, actually, Larry, I was misunderstanding. I thought you meant metaphorically Main Street. You actually mean literally Main Street.
Oh, literally Main Street. Yeah, yes, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, literally. Yeah.
Because that kind of deals with the not knowing that the parade route was going to go down and past the TSBD.
Yeah.
You don't have to rely on that information which came out, I think
Yeah.
on Tuesday.
You might not have known about the jog, but there's no political parade in Dallas ever that didn't go down Main Street.
Yeah, no, that really deals with that point. I think that's really good. Scott has another question for you.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, just for it just made me thinking about when you've been putting, you and David and Larry have been putting this together, whether Tosh Plumley's stories ever factored in, because who knows what to believe and whether his story's true or not, but certainly he talks about flying people into Dallas on the morning of the assassination. I think he even mentioned Red Bird Airfield as well. In fact, I'd need to go back and check my own files, etc. But I'm sure he talks that he actually landed a plane at Red Bird and also flew out of Red Bird later that day as well. That would all seem to be very, well, if he was very naive, you would just say that was a coincidence, but that would seem to be very relevant to what we're talking about just now. And I think he mentioned Johnny Rosselli. Did he have a nickname, the Colonel? Have I got that wrong? I'm not saying he was the same guy, that we're talking about earlier on, but there just seem to be a lot of coincidences and other people's names mentioned. I just wondered if that had been in your thoughts when you were putting this together.
Sure, Scott. And since this is being recorded and since I'm liable for anything that's being recorded for slander, I'll express it this way. I've had many personal interactions with Tosh and with his daughter and his family, who he abandoned multiple times. That's a matter of record, so I can say that. Early on in my research, I requested all the actual FBI documents I could get on Tosh, and I looked up all of his statements that he made to the press and when he made them. And at this point in my time, my evaluation is Tosh never said anything to anybody that hadn't already been said publicly and was available, and that nothing in any of the material that I obtained shows anything other than the fact that Tosh was routinely arrested for various types of things like renting airplanes and not returning them to the people he rented them from. There's no doubt he did smuggle stuff. There's no doubt, that some of the things he described, but every time Tosh got arrested, once he was in jail, apparently for some reason he would say, I've got to talk to the FBI. And the FBI would come by and he would tell them a very elaborate story, which apparently had the intent of getting him taken out of custody and given special treatment because he had special information. Scott, and yeah, and one of the things that's fascinating is over time, his story evolved considerably. In the first stories, no, Redbird's not part of it. Johnny Roselli's part of it. Actually, we know where Johnny Roselli was because we have FBI surveillance on him. He wasn't with Tosh Plumley. Okay. And in some of the first stories, the fascinating thing is when quote unquote Tosh flies the crew out of that was somehow sent to abort the attack, flies them out. His first stop is at Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, Texas. I served at Shepherd Air Force Base in the Air Force. Nobody is going to fly a transport plane into Shepherd Air Base. It was a training base. It was a SAC base. Anyway, long story short, I guess I'll just pass on his comments. But I didn't ignore them. I was fascinated. It's great stuff. I mean, I love it. It's great stuff. It did. And he and I had multiple exchanges all the way back to the 90s on CompuServe. And just not going there.
I met him once in Dallas and, enjoyed chatting to him. But And again, there was always just something in my mind that felt like he's either a disinformation agent or it's just, I don't know if it's just been made up, but I just had difficulty. It sounded too good to be true, a lot of it. And that just left a big question mark about his veracity of what he was saying.
I don't know that, I mean, he was certainly involved in some illegal activities, flying in, I can't say what he did or did not do. All I can say is that when he goes on record, other than talking to the press, okay, other than showing up as a source, when he goes on record to the FBI, all he is really doing is confusing the FBI, because they're obligated to look into his stories and they never find anything. So if he's a disinformation agent, it certainly, it led the FBI off in wasting a lot of time building a file on him. The other result is he got a lot of attention from people in the JFK community. He got, I can't explain his motives beyond that, but what I can say is it's not very good disinformation, because good disinformation always has a fair dose of real world stuff in it that's provable, and Tosh doesn't. So it's not well correct. If you look at a history of his appearances, at one point in one article, he states the only reason, he states that he knew all about what happened in Dallas after the fact, not before the fact, right? Because before the fact, he's just flying a plane in. After the fact, the CIA director makes a trip to Florida to explain to him everything that happened. And he knows that the CIA has warned Jack Kennedy, and they tried to abort the motorcade. They knew that the assassination was supposed to occur in front of the Adolphus Hotel. And all this detail, and it's like, do I really believe that the CIA director, after the assassination, went down to tell Tosh that? I sort of have a hard time with that. And that's not good disinformation. Good disinformation would make him look a lot more mysterious and has some credible reason for him to know what he's talking about.
I just wanted to throw that into the mix because I've only ever heard Red Bird Airfield mentioned in the context of Wayne January's story with Matthew Smith and also Tosh Plumley. So thanks for clarifying your views on that.
No, it's good to talk about, Scott. I guess what I'm trying to say is it is important to talk about it because it's been part of the thing forever and it occupied my time. I mean, I won't tell you how much money I spent back in the days when you had to pay for paper copies of people's files from NARA, and how, so it's important to know about it. It's like a lot of things you don't want to, they need to have been investigated. The only good news is to this extent, they were investigated to some extent, but Tosh was an active player in this arena until only a few years ago. One of his actual last actions that I know about personally was to try to convince Sherry Feister, meet with her and convince her where the shots were fired from. Sherry, for those of you know, is Deborah Conway's sister. And he's very convincing. I got to tell you, he's a convincing guy. He's sincere. We have to deal with people that appear to be quite sincere in this mess.
Larry, I've got another question. Maybe David can answer it. But in the paper that you mentioned, that the DRE had learned that Oswald had come into some money and gone to Mexico City and then gone back to Dallas. This theme crops up quite regularly, actually. We had Jack Lawrence and the Lincoln dealership thing, test driving a car because he's going to come into some money. Mary Hollis's interview at the Sixth Floor Museum alleges that he told her that he was going to come into some money. Rob Clark did a show, an event for us, and it was about Thomas Beckham, and there was a document there. I think it was an interview with somebody, possibly HSCA actually, in which there was an assertion that Oswald was going to come into some money. So where did you get this information from, vis-a-vis the DRE learning it?
Oh, this is from the DRE's conversation with Luce's description of what they told her. So ostensibly it's coming from the DRE, and they know this somehow. They know this because they've been observing Oswald.
Mm-hmm.
I will say a simple explanation for all of this, Oswald coming into some money, comes from David Phillips. Because if we were to believe David Phillips and his informant that he brought into the game only days after the assassination, we know where Oswald got the money. He was paid by the Cubans in the Cuban consulate, right? In fact, a red-headed Cuban gave him the money. And as recently as books that he was writing in the 1980s, David Phillips was still maintaining that Oswald had been paid money inside the Cuban consulate. So if all I'm saying is, if this were a propaganda story that had been devised by somebody, if you tie it all back together, it ties together very well. Yeah, everybody knew Oswald had come into some money because he'd been paid by the Cubans to kill JFK, which of course is exactly what fits him being a patsy, because the DRE didn't say that he was working by himself as a lone nut assassin. They said that he was in touch with the Cubans in Mexico and was part of an assassination team. He's not even a lone nut. So, Neil, does that answer? I can tell you that's where Luce heard it, but I think it comes from that original story that was being set up for Oswald having been paid by the Cubans in Mexico City.
Well, I guess it's either propaganda or he actually did come into some money.
Yeah.
It's binary, I guess.
So far, I don't see any sign of the money. I see a lot of the sign of the propaganda.
Yes. Well, he was going to go and buy some shoes for Marina, wasn't he, on the 22nd?
Well, that's true. He was worried about shoes for the baby, which is true. I mean, I think that's probably true, but that's probably a lesser sum than buying a car. Okay.
That's not real money. Yeah. Okay. Okay. And I had a question for David as well. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of digging between the weeds that you've done here. What have essentially been your primary sources?
Oh, Neil, I think we need to wrap this up though, because David needs to come down and show you who we speculate was actually at Red Bird.
Oh, okay. All right. Let's do that first.
Just kind of wrap it up, and then we can, and why we would think that. So David, over to you.
Well, just to answer Neil's question quick, a lot of it, Mary Farrell Foundation, a lot of the new document releases too. And as I look at the new documents, I work my way back to some of the older ones, and you can fill in the names of, and the crypts, who these people actually were at the time.
Wi-Fi.
So that's where I did. So wrapping it up, Larry, position. We can only guess and speculate.
We've talked about people that went to Dallas, including men and, women. I guess the point is, to my way of, I don't know if you have a picture of Anna Diaz, David, do we have that slide? We had it, I think does it show up in the Dealey Plaza? Does it show up in the Echo? Maybe that would be. Maybe we don't have it in the PowerPoint, but it's in the Echo article.
Right.
I guess to wrap it up, all we can offer is that we can show you that there were a couple of DRE members that had been in the Dallas area in October, possibly into November. We can name them. We can prove that they were there at that time. And that involves both a man and a woman who actually fit the descriptions that January gives for the people that showed up at Red Bird. And I think another part of the fit is that if they were there, again, what confuses things for me is they might still have been doing a propaganda thing with Oswald, or that doesn't necessarily make them part of a conspiracy if Oswald is still being set up for propaganda purposes. So the interesting thing is that those two individuals could have been involved in essentially a sanctioned propaganda activity, while somebody else has obtained a rifle and is going to plant it, and the whole thing is going to go, totally astray from what they have in mind, as Lee Oswald becomes a patsy in the assassination rather than part of a propaganda operation. But I think it's telling that the man and the woman from DRE who were in Dallas, who fit the description, primarily their role in DRE had been in propaganda for the CIA. For the matter of fact, David mentioned they had gone to international conferences, and they're back in Dallas, and the person who is very likely in Dallas with them, who was overseas with them doing propaganda, is none other than Carlos Hernandez, who is, we speculate, been maneuvering and manipulating Oswald from New Orleans on, and who may well have been a key player in actually going to the dark side and taking Oswald not just into a propaganda effort, but into an assassination. Somebody did it. Somebody set him up to actually be primarily looked at as the shooter. So I don't know if that was I thought we had a picture of Anita, but anyway, those are just, it's interesting to me because I was offered a picture of Anita as an actual player in the conspiracy and the assassination 25 years ago. And nobody could tell me how or why she would have been involved. And it just kind of fascinating to me to see her show up as a person of interest that fits this Red Bird lead from Wayne January to Matthew Smith. And like, oh, gee, how often does it? I've always been fascinated in JFK research. I don't want to look and find the things that I was looking for, because to me, that's a bad approach. If you find exactly what you were looking for, you might be driving yourself. When I find things that were totally unexpected to me, that's when I become convinced that something real is happening. So I guess we are now set up for final questions. David, do you have something more to say?
I don't. I think you covered that. Other than possibility Sylvia Odio knowing a little bit more about what was going on. She said, I don't know anything about the DRE when she was questioned, by the Warren Commission. So I don't know anything about it. But did you ever hear of von Silvestro? Oh yes, I've heard of him.
Yeah, a lot of people suddenly didn't know a lot of things you suspect that they did. But I do think it's interesting, that you bring that up. Neil asked about the money, which I thought was a great question because it shows up on so many threads in all of this. But the fact that the DRE caller to Claire Booth Luce the night of the assassination would say, we have absolute evidence and proof of Lee Oswald threatening to kill, we can provide you independent evidence of him threatening to kill JFK. You all tell me, where is there one solid indication of Lee Oswald having been associated with a threat to kill JFK? It's that call to Sylvia Odio after the visit. So that leads me to believe that these are the same people when you dig down to the core.
Okay. There is a photograph of Anita /Mirta in the article that's posted on DP UK website.
I think it's interesting. She's the only Cuban female that I've ever seen actually holding a weapon. She clearly is is serious about all this. I have books and books about the Cuban Revolution with all kinds of women who participated, but she's the only one I ever found holding a weapon.
Okay, well, I think that's been fantastic. I'm sure there's a few more questions before you go. Anybody, Matthew, anybody that's got some questions?
No, been a good talk. Very interesting.
Larry, David, you mentioned, I mean, obviously this came to light, the article last year, and you did this presentation for Lancer and you were on the Ocelli podcast. It's always a work in progress. Have you had any other mainstream quality researchers that have picked up on this and developed it at all for you?
No, the only thing that's really contributed to this that I've done is I think I mentioned earlier, the two things that have happened. David's intense research on JM Wave using the crypt busting, the fact that we now know so many of the crypts and can trace them to real people and know what their real activities were at different times. And for example, know what they were doing in 1963. That was something we never had before, but we can now document. But I think for me, it was more the foundation was in understanding a lot of these people going all the way back to the Cuban project, what their roles were, who they worked with, who they reported to. And that's what I covered in my book, In Denial. Don't know if anyone's read it, but I think that's the most contemporary exploration of the Cuba project and the Bay of Pigs that anybody's done. I say that with it. Most of what's been written about the Bay of Pigs is wrong. I hate to say that, and I know that's a strong statement, but that's because it was written before we know what we know now. And virtually everything the Cuban exile community thought about the Bay of Pigs and JFK was wrong because they were intentionally given a false story by certain CIA officers.
I've always been intrigued. I mean, there's all these different Cuban exile groups, Larry. I mean, what's the scale of all of this in terms of the revolution and who were, who had land confiscated and, who were obviously much more capitalist orientated? What's the scale of all of this in the scheme of things in terms of the number of groups or the number of people who are wholly active, operationally, logistically, not just funding it? Can you give us an idea of that?
The scale of the revolution or the scale of the exile community?
Yeah, the scale of the expats, the exiles. I mean,
there were literally hundreds of groups. Most of the groups consisted of no more than half a dozen people, because all of you had groups from the ultra right, the centrist, populist, agrarian, the academic, the students. They all had different views of what the revolution should have been, and they didn't agree. And a reason that many of them were exiles is they couldn't get it, they couldn't get it together before the revolution. And when Castro won, basically his view took over. So they all became exiled. They were all anti-Castro, but there was so much discord. We didn't mention it, but actually Villafana, who we think was the pilot at Red Bird, was driven out of his position with the Cuban Exile Air Force because there was so much political infighting. So even though there were dozens and dozens of groups and hundreds of people, they formed, they disappeared, they couldn't work with each other. People went from one group to another. It's chaotic at best. The only place where actually they come together and there's some consistency literally is CIA maritime operations out of JM Wave, and the exiles who were part of the original brigade, who received special training, went to New Orleans, Belle Chase, went on to do missions into Cuba. Some of them were asked to assassinate Castro. That didn't work. but there's a real significant bond. And you find several of them still working at least part-time for JM Wave in 1963. That's kind of the only constant is those individuals and their connections to certain CIA officers that they trusted. Even though, as David pointed out, DRE hated CIA, and actually some of the DRE leaders threatened to kill certain CIA officers, yet DRE members continued working for people they liked, like Lynch and Robertson, even though they were CIA. It's complex. Does that answer it?
Well, I think if anyone knows the answer, it's you. So I'm happy with that answer. I mean, as I say, it's not an area that I've really focused on. You have, and of course, you just read about all these different groups, and you don't know whether it's one man and a dog, or whether it's
often it was. Yeah, often it was one man and a dog, and maybe two of his buddies sometimes.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. Just as an anecdote, there was a big movement by a guy out of Chicago to found a new unity group. Okay, in 1963, he did manage to come up with some money. Like, we're going to pull this all together. He came up with money. He could actually distribute money. He gave money to various small groups, but in the end, none of them would join them.
Yeah.
And he could buy things. He bought a boat, he bought a submarine, but he couldn't get any of the Cuban exiles to join him. He actually had to pay money to Hargraves and some of Hemming's friends, Americans, to actually transport stuff to Miami because none of the Cubans wanted anything to do with it. It's, that's how bad it got.
It was Paulino Sierra Martinez. Yeah.
The Sierra
he was
Hunter.
he was a lawyer from Chicago, and a lot of his money, I think, came from the King's, the big ranch in Texas.
King Ranch, yeah.
Yeah, King Ranch in Texas.
But you can lose your mind trying to trace all that. I guarantee you. I think mine's somewhere back in the house.
I think Scott's got a question as well, haven't you, again?
Yeah, just a quick one. You mentioned Grace and Lynch a few times. He's a name I'm not really familiar with. And a book that he'd written, and I looked up Decision for Disaster, seems to be called. I'm sure we've all got a lot of books that we want to read. Is that one that you would recommend? Are we going to learn anything if we read that book?
I definitely recommend it. It does three things for you. A, it gives you some real insight into the Bay of Pigs as to how things really happened, because he was there. I mean, so if you really wanted to understand the Bay of Pigs from an on-site person, he does that well. What he doesn't do well, and what is misleading, is he thinks he knows what the plan is because of what he was told. What we know from what I covered in Denial is that he was fed a lot of bad information, and he doesn't know what was happening above him. So he became one of the key CIA officers who went back to Miami right after the disaster at the Bay of Pigs and carried the message that the entire reason for the failure was John Kennedy. And when you will read the book, you will see exactly how passionate, how outspoken. I mean, Lynch gives you this is my view. Lynch gives you the insight into the mentality of the people that actually killed John Kennedy. I won't say that he was personally involved, but the view that he describes in this book tells you why they did it. Now, people above them may have been manipulating them too. That's another story, but I'm talking about the guys that went to Dallas. So yes, I would recommend it. It's but recommend it for what it is. I without touting my own book, read Grayson Lynch's book and read In Denial, and then put the two together and you'll see what's going on and how badly Kennedy was misrepresented, because Bissell, who was in charge of the whole Cuba project, outright lied about Kennedy to everybody below him. And I didn't make that up. The guys who worked for him, who were finally shown the actual documents in the 90s, reached that conclusion that he was lying to them, and he set them up. And what they have to say about Richard Bissell is just about the same order of what Grayson Lynch has to say about JFK.
Yeah. Is it true that Kennedy ever promised any air cover? Is that what you're talking about in some of the new information that's coming out, that's all just, it's a myth really that he never said that they were going to do that?
Yeah. Basically, the upshot was that the military commanders kept going to Bissell and telling him how important the air cover was. And Bissell kept promising them that he would go to JFK and get the air cover committed and enlarged and increased. And what happened next was Bissell cut it without even talking with JFK, and told them in the end that it was JFK's decision, when in the end it was Bissell's decision. And when push came to shove, when we're talking about Villafana asking to talk to someone, it's that message never got to JFK. The military commanders that would have told JFK the truth were screened from talking to JFK by Bissell and Barnes.
So, sorry, if I picked that up correctly, it was Bissell then who basically didn't push the air cover issue with Kennedy, or well, why would he have done that? He wanted it to fail effectively.
I try to deal with that in the book, Scott. It's a long story. Most people don't understand is the plan for the Cuba project failed in October 1960. What happened at the Bay of Pigs and with the invasion was never supposed to happen. The plan started off in the spring of 60. It had failed by October. Bissell didn't want to admit that the plan failed, so he came up with this whole entire new plan for a conventional invasion, sold it literally because they didn't want to admit they'd failed. And all along the way, they continued failing right up to the landings and refused to admit it. And when JFK gave them an opportunity, like weeks in advance, to just pull the plug. I don't really want to do this. Are you sure you guys absolutely going to guarantee it's going to succeed with the commitments that I've given you? They wouldn't pull the plug. I can't explain Bissell's mentality. I can tell you that after the fact, from his own writings and remarks, he was psychologically in denial. I mean, Bissell had some kind of a problem that did not allow him to admit his own mistakes. And the director of the CIA had kind of backed off from the whole project. So had Helms. Everybody had kind of left it to Bissell to fail. Like this is the guy, and Kennedy is, Kennedy constantly gives them opportunities to pull back, and they just refuse to do so. Even when you wouldn't know this, but the two military commanders went to Bissell weeks before and resigned and said, there's just no way with what you laid out here, it's going to work. It's going to be a disaster. And at that point in time, Bissell promised them that he understood and he would go to JFK and make it different. And he told them that. And he said, if you resign and you guys that can make this happen, all these Cubans are going to die and it'll be your fault if you resign. And they bought that and they walked away, and he didn't do what he promised to do. Plus, now we know that there were some other things in play that nobody knew about other than Bissell, like most likely a fake attack on Guantanamo that didn't happen, that would have brought the military into a full-scale attack on Cuba, a carrier group that was dispatched to Cuba that JFK wasn't told about to conduct it? Long story.
Okay, thank you.
All right, guys. Larry, I've got one more question, but I'm going to ask that after I've stopped the recording. But prior to that, obviously, on behalf of DP UK, we want to thank you and David. Fantastic talk, really detailed, very, very interesting. So on that note, I'm just going to pause the recording.